I've been a fan of AltHistoryHub here for almost like 10 years. I've always enjoyed his videos. It's funny because I also make a lot of videos about alternative history maps and breaking down different maps. So I'm really excited for this one. What if Napoleon invaded Britain? And this is a scenario that I don't think I've actually covered.
The Battle of Trafalgar. The last great naval engagement in the Age of Sail.
So obviously the great Napoleon Bonaparte was never able to cross the English Channel. I can't even imagine what the world would have been like if he did though. It's funny how close he was from London, yet so far away.
Think you're so great because you have boats!
Battle that ended Napoleon's dreams of conquering his greatest foe. Britannia ruled the waves, and since he was unable to bring it under his boot, Napoleon opted for the continental system, a petty system of alliances aimed at crippling its economy.
Oh, so he's not even going to get this big in this universe, or at least he's going to first conquer Britain before he gets this big.
Sanctions. It was this system that eventually drove the Grand Armée
to
invade Russia. And we all know how that little
the inevitable ends of Napoleon's
England's
empire.
industrial might allowed it to pull in America and possess a larger fleet than the next 10 powers combined.
Jeez,
so
no
when the
wonder.
Franco-Spanish fleets attempted to unite, Admiral Nelson was ordered to chase them down across the Atlantic and ensure it went nowhere except the bottom of the ocean. So
of course we're covering what happened, and then later in the video we're going to cover, but what if other things happened?
Atlantic wild chase, the fleet was spotted near Cadiz in an attempt to cross Gibraltar. So the one-armed hero shadowed its movements, making sure it was
for like a boat admiral, right? Being one-armed. I feel like if you lose an arm, you instantly just need to start working in the Navy or just become a pirate.
Before he made his move. But on the 21st of October, 1805, his ships were spotted, and the Franco-Spanish fleet under Admiral Villeneuve attempted to escape back to Cadiz, despite their numerical superiority. Due to the skill...
It's funny, I don't know if we're going to discuss this much, but whenever I'm thinking of Spain during the Napoleonic era, I just think about how they were like the Vietnam for the French here. There was just so much chaos happening in Iberia.
Of the recruits and the nature of the command, the fleet lost all cohesion and failed to form a line. Meanwhile, an anxious and eager Nelson broke with tradition and ordered his fleet to engage head-on, instead of the usual, let's line up and fire till one of us.
Obviously, this is not historically accurate footage, but it looks like it could be.
Tactic of the day. I mean, if that's what you can even call a tactic. Despite the
surprisingly
really slow winds, which turned the HMS Victory into a sitting duck.
Side note, I love history channels that like break down the battlefields like this. Like I love the overlook of what was going on with the different army divisions, or in this case, boats as they moved around.
The British didn't just prevail, they annihilated the Franco-Spanish fleet and managed to capture the majority of their ships of the line. Nelson lost his life pulling off the maneuver. But in return, Napoleon lost his hope of ever planting a French flag on the Tower of London.
Dang, so you know he said it was worth it.
Went the other way. Could a reverse Normandy ever be pulled off? If so, how far would Napoleon go? All right, Jimmy.
It's a very interesting question. I mean, if you think about it, if you just eliminate the British boats, I think Napoleon's army was going to be able to take on the British army, depending on what year.
So this scenario won by a landslide in the previous community poll. And to do it justice...
Oh man, there were some good ones in there. Talked about so many times. I love the scenario of what if India was an island. That also would have been interesting. What if Russia won the Russo-Japanese War?
And to do it justice, I called in my friend Emperor Tigerstar to help me try out something new. Instead of looking at the overall big picture and aftermath, let's seriously dig into this. Let's try a realistic,
that's awesome.
Napoleonic.
Wow, I'm getting some crazy nostalgia right now. With Emperor Tigerstar as well.
I'm talking.
Oh man, Napoleon winning the British every day. Oh, every week.
Engagements, troop numbers,
that's
and defenses. Cool. That requires a lot of research. But luckily, many of you signed up for the Napoleon's Gambit Discord event and wrote a ton of wonderful essays that helped with this video. Special shout out to the top 3 writers on each side, who saved me a lot of time in the Napoleonic rabbit holes. Alright, so let's start at the point of divergence itself. How does the legendary admiral lose Trafalgar? Simple. Ever since ancient times, naval battles tend to be
just ram the boats.
an all-or-nothing gambit
Oh,
where
wow.
retreat is not really an option. You rarely see an engagement which ends up in a stalemate, and more often than not, experimental tactics like that of Nelson end in failure. What helped him here was the fact that the Franco-Spanish fleet failed to form a cohesive line. But what if in this timeline, they did? Suddenly, the decision to advance on a numerically superior foe who could fire freebies at you while you advance turns into a horrible idea.
Was this, now I'm just curious, was this the same Spanish Navy that just decided to go with the tactic of mucho cannons equals mucho damage? Out of all the naval doctrines out of Europe from this time period, I gotta say, Spain is gotta be the most convincing. How do you even defeat that strategy?
First of all, Nelson led from the front, and he would be the first ship to sink,
So there you
sending
go.
a wave of panic throughout the rest of the Royal Fleet's ships.
No
From this
coordination.
point on, they could choose to either turn back, advance, or resort to traditional tactics a little too late.
Maybe
In
all-
three
maybe
of those
all three.
scenarios, the British fleet is obliterated, with some
this
ships even
B-roll footage is so
surrendering to
great.
the enemy. Instantly, Britain would lose its best admiral and half of its first-rate ships. But that doesn't mean London would fall the next day. So what would
No.
happen? Well, Jimmy, time
But
to find out.
it could be the beginning of the end. If the British fleet just magically disappeared at this moment, well, then they're absolutely screwed. How long would it take a ship to get built? Okay, who knows how accurate this is because it's from Quora. But this is between 1 to 5 years, with the average around 18 months or 2 years to build one frigate from the British perspective. So yeah, if they pretty much just lose like 75% of their fleet at this time, they're a dead man walking. So the year is
The Battle of
1805.
Trafalgar
Napoleon
was fought just
gonna
a
beat
day
Austria.
after Napoleon executed the Ulm maneuver on the 20th of October,
Ulm.
1805. But why is that memorable? Well, because 23,000 Austrians were
Jeez.
captured, bringing the total number of prisoners to 60,000. Within a month,
Can you
Napoleon captured Vienna.
Can you
but all of
switch 'em?
this paled in
These soldiers?
comparison to what
Slave
he was
soldiers?
about to do in December. Despite what the recent movie by Ridley Scott would have you believe,
I love that we're referencing
Austerlitz
this.
was not fought over a frozen lake. In fact, most of that movie is Hollywood at its worst. Woof. What's
Yes.
so sad about that is
I still love the memes though. I still have to. I mean, it's such a memeable movie. We've got to use it.
it really was Napoleon's magnum opus, a battle in which his tactical genius decimated the combined Austro-Russian armies and solidified himself as one of the best generals in history. He had many great victories before and after Austerlitz, but this was his masterpiece. The War of the Third Coalition was over, the Holy Roman Empire was dissolved, and Napoleon was
Finally
free
got
to
rid of that.
finally look beyond the channel. And now you'll finally get a chance, little guy.
Yeah, this is a very interesting D-Day preparations. It is an interesting situation because if the British lost pretty much all their fleet, or, you know, again, like the majority, and he thought he had a chance to invade Britain, he's not going to care about Russia. Of course, he's going to take out his biggest rival ever.
Ever since he got back from his campaign, Napoleon continued his postponed invasion. A year prior, he had selected 200,000 troops, stationing them at Boulogne, before he had to fight Austria.
I'm curious-
The drills would continue as supplies were stockpiled, and the fleet
Where
was
exactly
being
they're going to,
repaired.
like, how well are we going to predict the British army is going to fight? Because the stuff I've always read is that the British army wasn't really that impressive for the most part because they weren't focused on that. It was all about their fleet. So I'm curious with this scenario, like how well they're going to be able to fight, you know, momentarily. I'm sure they're not going to be able to last forever.
French had a larger force, more experience, and used a meritocratic system which saw the best officers being promoted. Britain, on the other hand, followed a more traditional military chain of command.
Remember
where
that
men
we are talking just after the American Revolutionary War, like a couple decades after.
were promoted based on seniority. Thanks to the report made in 1805, we know the exact number of troops
Wow.
guarding the Isles. As
Oh,
you can
wow.
see, it's not even close. I mean, sure, the equipment of the British was marginally better both in terms of firearms and artillery, and their dragoons were to be feared. But should the Grand Armée make its way onto the flat fields of England, the Brits are toast.
Yeah.
Thing is, they already knew that. That's why they spend a fortune building up
Oh.
their defenses.
Yeah.
The no-brainer targets like Portsmouth, Hastings, and Dover were all armed to the teeth. We're talking giant Mortello
Jeez.
towers spread across the coast, medieval castles refitted into powerful strongholds like Cowes, Deal, and Sandgate, an intricate chain
is what I'm
of
saying. They
signal
didn't care that
towers
they didn't have the
capable
strongest
of
army.
instantly warning London of upcoming attacks, ripped straight out of Lord of the Rings.
Jeez.
Then finally, you have the Royal Military Canal near Hastings, In typical British fashion, instead of erecting a wall, they dug a massive canal.
That's hilarious.
60 feet wide and 9 feet deep. This created an extra line of defense. All of this was done in our timeline, despite the Trafalgar win. But here, as soon as Parliament hears
so they're
going to
go crazy with the defenses.
These projects are upscaled and finished early.
Yeah, times 10. Now that's a really interesting aspect. Britain loses the majority of their fleet. They're going all in on like, okay, well, there's definitely going to be a land invasion. We need to build literally every defense.
Get the most important line of defense at King George's disposal, the English Channel itself. In normal circumstances, the voyage from Boulogne to Hastings is no more than 8 hours. However, making such a trip in the winter is pretty much insanity. I even found this barometric pressure data report dating all the way back to 1748. And let me tell you, weather conditions around this time were bleak. Keep in mind that this only applies to the channel itself, meaning that Britain was free to recall some of its fleet scattered across the empire. So
that's a really good point. I was waiting to bring up a map like that. Remember, the British could always reinforce from their colonies like Australia, British Raj, South Africa, Canada. It's also very important to note that the British Empire was not even close to their peak just yet. They would obviously reach that way after the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, they were barely getting started in Australia, not even really in New Zealand, hadn't conquered all of South Asia yet, and South Africa wasn't quite as thick. So there is extra reinforcements and support that's going to be around the world, but not as much as you might think. I mean, this isn't like a World War I Britain or World War II Britain. They did not, in fact, control 25% of the Earth's surface yet.
Across the empire. So for the next 6 months, both sides had time to prepare for the clash of the century.
Wow. That would be, oh boy.
While waiting for the Channel waters to calm, Napoleon appointed 2 of his marshals on a side quest. Marshal Davout and Marshal Soult. Both of them had distinguished themselves at the Battle of Austerlitz.
I like how they have very similar stances right there.
Other commanders, were perfectly capable of leading an army on their own. Known for their aggressive and fast-paced tactics, they are the perfect choice to lead
are they getting
the
Ireland on their side?
That was brewing. You see, if you didn't know, Ireland's never been the biggest fan of British rule. But with the last couple of years in particular, discontent grew into violence. The 1798 and 1803 rebellions in particular provided a window of opportunity for the French.
Yes, and not to mention a little important thing, this was still before the Irish lost all their potatoes, so there'd be even more upset Irish people. They hadn't left their island just yet.
On the 5th of March 1806, a portion of the French Armada makes its way to the western coast of Ireland and splits in 2. This armada was made up of 102
I like that they are going this route
carrying
first.
10,000 French troops, alongside 4 battalions of the Irish League. They were escorted by 67 warships, mostly frigates and smaller ships of the line. Marshal Davout landed in Ballybunion, while Soult assaulted Kilkenny. The signal towers were triggered.
I really love
by the time the British were aware of the invasion, the relatively small expeditionary force was already on their shores. The British, who were busy training thousands of recruits, building ships and fortifying England,
they would not be
caught off guard.
Yeah, they would not be prepared.
The Royal Navy was dispatched, and General Ormsby Vandeleur was ordered to repel the invaders. Within 2 weeks, the French advanced on Limerick and Galway,
French and
with the
allies.
local populace rallying behind them. France had sent 1,000 men 8 years earlier, but these troops, and the renown of their marshals, had lit a spark, a hope, for a free Irish state. Both cities fell within days, and thanks to the location near the Golden Vale of Ireland, these 2 swift armies
what a crazy reality. Historically, Scotland and France have had alliances in the past, but now even Ireland and the French, I always forget how to pronounce this, the Allude Alliance. This is obviously way before the Napoleonic Wars, but still, French and Celtic alliances still going strong.
Point, Ormsby and the Navy were in position to challenge the French.
Makes me think about
the British force in Ireland prior to the invasion stood at 34,000 strong, with another 20,000 militia, but they were mostly garrisoned near Cork, Waterford, and Dublin. Ormsby had
they might just be focused on
men at his disposal, but he couldn't risk splitting his force as
still
the French
main
did.
British Isles.
Given the dilemma on which front to focus on, he chose Galway, which would allow
so the
for
big battles,
fire
at least some battles, will be happening in Ireland
first. By the time
first.
he got there, Soult had already moved north, living off the land, and arming Irish rebels everywhere he went.
Oh,
this
man.
triggered a wave of panic,
Crazy.
expressing itself in dozens of punitive raids against the Irish. Britain was more vulnerable than ever.
Oh, and if they're raiding the peasants in the Irish countryside, that's obviously going to backfire horribly. The Irish people really going to rise up hard.
Those who sided with the French were hanged in the hundreds.
I
Napoleon
mean, they have to
had started
put some
a
fear in,
guerrilla
but I still think it would be
campaign
a
at the British back door,
pretty
forcing them to
backfire
spend
tactic.
precious time and material chasing his two war dogs.
I like how the Irish
At the end
peasants
of
are shorter.
March, Ormsby managed to
leprechauns or
capture an
something?
encrypted message. The text is relayed to code breaks in Dublin, detailing Napoleon's orders to DeVoe to capture and hold Cork until late May, where the full invasion force would land.
D-Day? Are they going to take the Isle of Man
1806,
first?
Our dear King
They're gonna
George
control
III
Ireland,
was,
the island, and then-
well, let's just say mentally unstable. And despite his proclamations that if Napoleon lands in England, he would meet him in battle, the real command is split between two men. General John Moore, the man who initiated the construction of the military connection.
Wait, this is going to throw me down a rabbit hole. Yeah, that would be the same King George that the Americans fought for their own independence. That's crazy. King George definitely would be losing his mind. Wow, look at that reign, 1760 to 1820. That's a long time too, 59 years. I didn't realize it was that long.
And Martello Towers, and Prince Frederick, the Duke of York, a man mocked for his disastrous Flanders campaign. Since then, however, the Duke became commander-in-chief, and learned from his mistakes, completely reorganizing and reforming the British army.
Well, that would be very
Upon
interesting
breaking
because the
message,
British do have
Parliament
months to
immediately
prepare
ordered them
and to
prepare
finally
for the Irish invasion.
get their army
Multiple
put together.
squadrons were ordered to patrol the waters, and General David Dundas was transported directly to Cork at the head of 10,000 soldiers. Little did they know, this was all part of Napoleon's plan.
I still don't think they're going to be able to beat
to
Napoleon in a
rampage
land
through the
battle,
Irish
obviously.
countryside, DeVoe prepared to lay siege to Cork. However, this was all just a ruse. On June 6th,
I love that they're
another
using Ireland here. This
expeditionary
is
force, this time
very interesting.
26,000 strong, sailed from Boulogne to Eastbourne. Upon arrival,
Oh,
the French
boy.
flagship Bucentaure fired down a
land in the
massive
mainland now.
barrage on the city's defenses. Napoleon had called upon
This
the
reminded me of the
assistance
Pirates of the Caribbean
Spanish,
ride.
Dutch, and even Danish fleets to assist him. This was
because
the
they were
real
all under
deal.
control there?
Napoleon himself
Of Napoleon?
descended upon the battered city with his best troops.
Oh,
And
he's gonna
within
march into
6
London
hours
first?
Of him
Oh,
sailing
Total War
from
reference.
France, he was finally on English.
Side note, I love like B-roll from video games. Obviously everyone uses like, B-roll secondary footage from movies and things like that, but big fan of when games are used because games have got so much good like gameplay stuff like this.
Admiral Collingwood raced to the landing site and clashed with the French Navy. However, their strategy was only to hold the Royal Navy at bay, buying time and then retreating back towards Calais. In the meantime, Bonaparte sent out another one of his trusted commanders
Marshal
to take
Ney.
Hastings. Marshal Ney took 6,000 men and headed east, while
Bam,
the rest
look
of
at
the
that
army
twist.
headed west. Napoleon always liked to study a battlefield days before a battle, and he knew that the English would not give up Brighton without a significant resistance. By the time of the attack, the British regulars
This is going to be
were
interesting
now
because we're
close to
talking about like the detailed version of how Napoleon would invade the British Isles and things like that. I'm really curious about the aftermath of that, to study the map. We'll probably get into that maybe at the very, very end. But what happens to the British Empire? We showed maps of what they look like in 1815. Does Napoleon just like de facto puppet all that stuff? Canada, South Africa, India?
1,000, a quarter of which were cavalry, which can quickly react to the breach. Yet most of the defenders were spread across
Also,
a wide
if
front,
Napoleon does this
and
successfully,
nearly
does
a
he still go
third
out and
were
invade
back
Russia,
in
and does that
Ireland.
still become
Brighton
a
and
disaster?
Hastings were extremely well fortified, but the
These
Duke
are all
of
questions
York
we should ask
knew
later.
they would always fail without reinforcements. Troops and ships from York were recalled, but before they could properly deploy, news arrived of another French drop.
Dang.
Hot air balloons were used to discover the
Oh, that's
movements
cool.
of the Royal Navy. And several hours after it had passed by Dover,
That's a cool
the French
concept.
sprung into action. Marshal Murat and another
Hey, look at that guy's
15,000
hair.
Frenchmen set sail from The Hague and
Wow.
landed at Great Yarmouth on June 18th. This flamboyant cavalry commander was given free
Okay,
rein
so
from
we're gonna
Napoleon
address it.
to
He
raid
does
as
look
much of the Norfolk flatlands
bit that
as
way.
he wished. Instead of directly attacking Norwich, he galloped through the
Irish
English
rebels literally have taken over all of
opening a
the
new front,
Ireland island.
with 5
It's all
separate
green.
armies roaming the
It's probably not every single one of them, but a lot of them, we don't know where they're at. Also, you know, speaking of Vietnam tactics.
Isles. Where exactly would you
Ireland
tell your
would be a
navy
good
to
Vietnam,
go
possibly.
if, say, you were the one in charge of the defense?
Ooh.
Do you prevent more reinforcements to join up with Napoleon? Do you protect the crucial coastline cities? What about another
personally,
attack
I
on
say
Ireland?
I would
the Channel
screw. If I
Islands,
was leading London, I don't
Cornwall?
care about
As
Ireland.
you can see, this would be a nightmare for the crown. But there was a glimmer of hope.
But they're
Hastings
already
was
in
on the
Ireland, so-
brink, and right as it was about to surrender, John Moore arrived with 23,000 soldiers, using the range superiority of his artillery, as well as the Royal Horse Artillery. He was able to surround the 6,000 men
Oh, wow.
led by Ney and obliterate them. The brave
Ooh.
marshal fought until the end, but ultimately, he failed as emperor. Upon receiving news of this counterattack, Napoleon ordered his men to move against Brighton. The signal
Isn't Napoleon
towers
located
were
at this
lit, and
in this
the Royal
region too?
Navy was ordered to assist the siege, and that is when the French Navy ferried yet another army into the fray. This time it was at Bernadotte, with 24,000 men who sailed from Calais to Ramsgate.
Dang, they're
Without
going
a navy to
spread
resist
out
him,
strategies
Marshal
here.
was able to take the landing and immediately marched against Dover Castle, taking a sandwich and a deal along the way. Lastly, the final hand Napoleon had to play
these
was
tactics.
overwhelming the already stretched thin Royal Navy by sending not one, but 2 separate fleets transporting 10,000
They're just trying to
men
completely
each
eliminate the
from
Royal
Brest.
Navy.
Britain had the capability to protect Cork, lay down supporting fire on Brighton, blockade the coast to prevent supplies from aiding the armies already in England, and prevent more armadas from sailing in, but it couldn't do all of that at the same time. So when the towers made their signal, only one of the fleets could be intercepted in time. Okay, pause. I was trying to analyze wind patterns and garrison sizes to figure out which would get intercepted, but screw it. Let's do a coin toss.
I like
Tails. While the fleet
mean,
aiming for Weymouth
at the end of the
does
day,
arrive
that's-
at its destination,
sometimes it's all up to
one
chance.
gunning for Milford is completely annihilated.
that. Battle of Brighton.
In an attempt to cut off the head of the snake, the Duke of York rode out to meet Napoleon with an army twice his size, sealing the fate of Dover,
It's
which
Napoleon, though.
Bernadotte managed to take. Elsewhere, Murat and the Irish rebels
This
made
is so
enormous
chaotic.
gains,
I cannot imagine
putting
what would be
pressure
going
on
through
Parliament. The French landings
British
made
leadership's
too many
heads.
casualties, but luckily for them, a man by the name of Dominique Larry was among them.
They gotta start
The father
sending some of their
modern
puppets and
military
allies.
medicine
They're losing a lot of French citizens out here. Let your allies take more casualties, I feel.
much during the previous campaigns, especially the one in Egypt, and his reforms made the French
Oh, yeah,
army
when Napoleon
leagues
shot
ahead
the
of its
pyramid, that
competition.
definitely
Disease prevention, bandaging, amputation, triage, ambulances, all contributed to something the rest of the world would adopt 50 years later.
Logistics.
Despite being the attacker, Napoleon sustained 3 times fewer casualties as a result of these improvements and their experience. With Brighton under blockade and with an army fast approaching, Bonaparte took 15,000 men and
Yeah, I love
occupied
this style of
the
video.
hills
This
to
is
the
cool.
east. In this fateful encounter, the Emperor fought the Duke at the Battle
like
of
a video
Brighton,
game.
adding another masterpiece to his resume. The crucial moment of the battle was Marshal Lannes charging through the British right flank, breaking their lines. While the French artillery bombarded the center, Napoleon then made his way west and captured Portsmouth. After a 2-week
Oh, man, so they're gonna grab all
while
the
rest of
ports.
his generals secured the
boy.
coastline all the way up to Dover. The Martello Towers were captured, and now with such a vast front, the
I can't
French
even imagine the
sailed
casualties.
through
Maybe
a
he'll
single
talk about
day
possible
and
casualty
delivered
numbers.
80,000 troops safely to England. The unstopping
Reverse
avalanche
Normandy.
made its way to London, smashing
It's funny, we've seen this scenario play out so many times, but it's always what if Germany in World War II did the reverse D-Day. Never the French, so this is fascinating.
everything in its path, loudly proclaiming that
I don't see
Napoleon
scenarios
was
like this a
here,
lot.
not as a conqueror, but a liberator, ready to strip
what,
the
though?
aristocracy down
Oh, okay.
and finally give freedom to the people. No matter how much aid arrived from the
French-controlled
Empire,
British
London
Isles.
was doomed,
That's
and
crazy.
with it, its most important institutions, Parliament, the Bank of England, the headquarters of the East India Company, and
Oh, that's
all
right.
of Westminster.
I mean, the East Indian Company for a time there was more powerful than the British government at times. They have like having more ships. They gave the British government a loan I was reading about earlier this week when the actual government itself ran out.
Vote was made, and rather than seeing it all burn to ash, envoys were sent to Napoleon to receive terms. Within a couple of months, Bonaparte became the unquestioned emperor of Europe. French flag flew over the Tower of London.
Imagine. I'm just imagining that picture of, well, I shouldn't even be talking about this right now. That famous picture of the mustache man from Austria, the German leader, posted up in front of the Eiffel Tower when the Germans took over in World War II. I'm imagining Napoleon, I'm imagining that, but he's like in front of Big Ben or something, which actually wouldn't be possible because that was built in 1859. This is like 1806. Some building, whatever.
Similarly to his terms to Austria, he chose to be modest in his demands. Gibraltar was handed to the Spanish. Malta became French. A permanent French garrison was posted at Dover, and the majority of the British possessions in the Caribbean were given over to France. Ireland was given full independence, and the Australian penal colonies were transferred to Napoleon, who was fascinated by the new continent. But how long does this situation endure before the next coalition? What is the reaction of Prussia, Russia, and Jefferson's America? Well, by now you know the drill. When the sequel poll drops, make sure to vote if you want a continuation of this timeline.
I think we're going to need a continuation here. We're going to need a part 2. Immediately, I'm fascinated by the fact that Canada's just going to become Quebec again. From French-speaking to English-speaking to back to French-speaking, all this is going to become French territory. This is also before the War of 1812, so the new United States wouldn't fight. I would assume they wouldn't be fighting the British and Canada, but I have a feeling they'd probably end up fighting the French somehow in this scenario, even though the U.S., well, I'm not sure. They attempted to remain neutral, but with the French taking over the world like that, I don't think they would be able to do. Well, yeah, they'd probably have to fight. Again, that video was by Alternative History Hub. Please go subscribe. I hope there's definitely part 2.
Big ol' thanks to my patrons. Drew's Argentinian grandpa. Lucas, the Canadian Goose from Avoca.
Drew har förvisats från Sverige för brottet att vara dans.
Amateur Archaeology. Sarsath. Carmel Saida. DaBeautiful-MEGAN-Underwood. I'm your dad back with the milk. Look out, InquisitorXarius. Sebby, if you hear this, and Tambre.